New York City, October 1880. The Vandermir Charity Gala was the kind of event that reminded General Edmund Calloway why he had preferred war. War at least was honest about what it was. He stood near the east column of the Vandermir ballroom. 12 chandeliers, 300 guests, 4 senators, and 1 duke who had arrived 40 minutes late and immediately occupied the center of the room the way certain men occupied space, as though it existed for them. Edmund had watched that entrance without expression. He watched it the way he used to watch a ridgeline before an engagement, noting what moved, what didn't, and what was pretending to be something it wasn't. The Duke of Ashmere was pretending to be a gentleman. He was doing it well enough that most of the room believed him. Edmund did not. General? Colonel Reeves materialized at his shoulder, a glass of champagne in each hand, offering one with the hopeful expression of a man trying to improve someone else's mood. You look like you're planning artillery positions. I'm always planning something. Edmund took the glass, did not drink. Who invited him? Reeves followed his gaze to where the Duke stood in a circle of admiring faces, smiling with all his teeth. Mrs. Vandermir. He donated $3,000 to the hospital fund last spring. Bought himself a very warm welcome. He donated $3,000 to appear charitable in a city where he has no natural allies. Edmund set the glass on a passing tray. That's an investment, not generosity. Reeves said nothing. He had served under Edmund for 11 years and had learned that silence was often the correct response. The ballroom moved around them. Silk and conversation, the clink of crystal, the practiced laughter of people who had rehearsed themselves into pleasantness. Edmund watched it all and looked, without appearing to look, for a woman in dark wool who would not be at the center of any of it. A woman who would be near the edges doing something useful, because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. He found her at 12 minutes past 9. She was standing near the service corridor entrance, speaking quietly with an older woman whose color had gone wrong, too pale, too still, the particular stillness of someone managing pain rather than feeling it. Margaret Hale had her hand at the woman's wrist, 2 fingers precisely placed, counting. Her face was calm and professional, and she was doing triage in the middle of a charity gala without anyone else in the room noticing she was doing it. Edmund noticed. He had been noticing Margaret Hale for 5 years. She wore dark blue tonight, not the plain wool he associated with her, but still modest by the standards of this room. Her hair was pinned with the practical efficiency of someone who didn't trust elaborate arrangements to survive a working evening. She was 36 years old, and she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had spent years in field hospitals and had never entirely come back from them, not because the war had broken her, but because it had made her permanently, irreversibly competent in a world that preferred its women decorative. The older woman's color was improving. Margaret said something that made her smile, guided her to a chair near the wall and straightened, turning back toward the room with the contained composure that Edmund had first seen on a muddy Virginia field in 1864 and had not stopped thinking about since. She saw him. Across 30 feet of ballroom, past the chandeliers and the silk gowns and the senators and the pretending duke, her eyes found his, with the same directness she brought to everything. She didn't smile, neither did he. They looked at each other for the length of a full breath. Then she crossed the room toward him, and he waited. And it was exactly like every time before, the specific relief of a man who had spent weeks in empty rooms finally standing in one that wasn't. General Calloway, her voice was low and even. Mrs. Hale, he inclined his head, the woman by the wall. Mild arrhythmia. She'll be fine if she stays seated and stops wearing that corset. Margaret glanced back briefly. Her lady's maid has been told. Did you diagnose her in the middle of a conversation about something else? She mentioned feeling lightheaded. I took her pulse while we talked about the hospital fund. She didn't notice. The edge of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Old habit. From the field. From the field. They stood together in the particular comfortable silence that had taken them 2 years to build, and that Edmund valued more than most conversations. Around them, the gala continued its machinery. The orchestra began a waltz. He's here, Margaret said quietly, without temperature. I know. She was looking at the Duke across the room, and her face had done the thing it did when she was deciding not to feel something. A small, precise stillness, like a door closing on the correct side. Edmund had seen that expression on her exactly 3 times. Once when she'd told him her husband was dead. Once when she'd learned the field hospital funding was being cut. Once when she'd shown him the Duke's first letter. "When did it arrive?" he said. "Yesterday morning, hand-delivered." She kept her voice level. "He's retained a solicitor. The claim is that Thomas owed his family $500 from a debt contracted in Baltimore in 1872. He's saying the medal was offered as collateral." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "Thomas's estate was settled in 1875. The solicitor argues the debt predates the settlement and was excluded in error." "And the medal?" "They claim Thomas offered it as security." She paused. "In writing." Edmund looked at the Duke across the room, who was laughing at something one of the senators had said, and felt, not fury, something colder and more deliberate than fury, the thing that had served him better than anger in every engagement he had ever fought. Clarity. "He wants the medal," Margaret said, "or he wants me frightened enough to stop refusing him. I'm not certain which is the actual goal." "Both," Edmund said. "The medal is the instrument, your capitulation is the goal." "That's what I thought. Do you still have Thomas's financial records from that period?" "Yes, everything. I keep everything." She paused, "including every document bearing Thomas's signature. Don't respond to the solicitor yet." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for when he said things she'd already decided. "I wasn't going to." "Good." He turned back to the room. The Duke had moved, was now speaking to Mrs. Aldrich, who was laughing too readily. "Stay away from him tonight." "I intend to." "If he approaches you—" "Edmund." His name in her mouth, quiet and precise, the way she said it when she wanted him to stop treating her like a tactical problem. "I've been managing men like him since before I met you." He looked at her. She looked back. Between them, the distance they had agreed to maintain and kept almost maintaining held its shape. "I know," he said. She nodded once, and then a guest materialized at her elbow with a question, and she turned to answer it, and Edmund Calloway stood with his untouched champagne and watched the Duke of Ashmere smile at Mrs. Aldrich and calculated with the precision of a man who had never lost an engagement he had properly prepared for, exactly how this was going to end. 16 years ago, he had not known her name. That was the first thing that had stayed with him, the fact of his own ignorance. He was a general. He commanded 3,000 men. He had the names of every officer in his division memorized along with their strengths and their liabilities, and he had not known the name of the woman who kept those men alive for 3 weeks, while he was incapacitated with a chest wound that should have killed him. He learned it afterward. The Battle of Cold Ridge had been a disaster in the first 48 hours, a Confederate feint that drew his forward units into a valley with bad sightlines and worse luck. Edmund had taken a rifle ball through the left shoulder on the second day, which he had managed. The infection that followed he had not managed as well. By the time his aide got him back to the field hospital at Brannock Creek, he had been running a fever for 36 hours and was, by his own later admission, not entirely present. What he remembered: a low voice, precise, giving instructions that were followed without question. The organized sound of a hospital under pressure, but not in chaos. The difference between those two states was everything, and he had heard it from behind the fever, and understood it was being maintained by skill, not luck. What he remembered: a hand checking his dressing with efficient care, and a voice saying not to him but to someone across the tent, "Captain Morrison needs the morphine more than the general does. Give it to Morrison." And then, directed at him now, "You'll manage. You've been managing for 2 days, a few more hours." It was not comfort. It was a statement of observed fact. He had found it in the fog of fever more steadying than comfort would have been. He managed. When the fever broke on the 4th day, he asked his aide who the woman was. His aide looked surprised. "That's Mrs. Hale, sir. Thomas Hale's wife. She's been working the hospital since Cold Ridge. Before that, she was 2 years with Dr. Emmett at Shenandoah." Thomas Hale was a lieutenant in the 9th Infantry. Edmund knew the name. A solid officer, steady under pressure, the kind of man you wanted in a forward position because he didn't panic. His wife, Edmund now recalled from intake paperwork, had come through proper channels. Appointed as a contracted nurse to the field hospital at Brannock Creek in the spring of 1864, her application signed by Dr. Emmett and countersigned by the regimental surgeon. She had been 20 years old and had trained for 2 years before setting foot near a battlefield. "The men say she's better than half the surgeons," his aide added. Edmund had filed this, and not spoken to Margaret Hale directly, until the day he was well enough to sit upright and she came to check his wound. "You kept this hospital running," he said. She didn't look up from the dressing. "The staff kept it running." "You directed the staff." "Someone had to." A precise nod. "Hold still." "I am holding still." "You're about to object to something, I can tell." He had looked at her then, really looked for the first time without fever distorting it. She was 20 years old, dark-eyed, with the focused composure of someone who had decided that being unshakable was not optional. There was ink on her right hand. She had been writing patient notes at, he checked the light, 6 in the morning. "You have been awake since yesterday," he said. "That's not your concern, General." "Mrs. Hale, when did you last sleep?" She met his eyes for the first time. Hers were dark brown, direct, and they assessed him with the same clinical attention she had given his wound. 4 hours ago. "I'm fine." That was a lie. The corner of her mouth moved. It was an acceptable approximation. He had made a decision in that moment, a small one, the kind that didn't feel significant at the time. He would remember her name. He would make sure that when the records of Cold Ridge were compiled, the field hospital at Brannock Creek was in them, with her name attached to the outcome. He did all of those things. He had also, though he did not admit this to himself for another decade, never stopped thinking about the woman with ink on her hand, who told him he would manage and was right. Thomas Hale died in the spring of 1875. Not in battle. The war had been over for 10 years. He died of a fever in a rented room in Baltimore, where he had been working as a logistics consultant. He was 41 years old. The marriage had been, by all accounts, Edmund had quietly gathered, a decent one. Solid, respectful, built on shared experience and mutual regard. She wore mourning for a year. Then she came to New York. Edmund had known she was coming before she arrived. He had not engineered it. He was precise about that distinction, had examined it more than once to be sure. He had simply known, through the network of former officers and army physicians that constituted his social world, that Margaret Hale was moving to New York to work as a private nurse, that she had taken lodgings on West 23rd Street, that she had 3 clients already, all referred by Dr. Emmett. He had waited 4 months before contriving to be introduced at the Harrington dinner. She had looked at him across the drawing room and said, "I know who you are, General," in a tone that indicated she was not particularly impressed by it, and he had felt, obscurely, like a man who had just passed a test he hadn't known he was taking. They had spoken for 20 minutes that first evening, about the hospital funding cuts, about the Sternberg report on field medicine, about whether New York society was more or less exhausting than a Virginia field hospital in August. "At least the field hospital was honest about being unpleasant," she said. "You find society dishonest?" "I find it elaborately committed to pretending things are fine when they aren't." She looked at him with those direct dark eyes. "You don't, particularly." Pretending compromises assessment. That's a very military way to explain common honesty. "I'm a very military person." "I know." She had looked at him in a way he couldn't entirely read. "Thomas thought highly of you." He said carefully, "He was a good officer." "He was." A brief pause. "He would have found this room just as exhausting as I do." Something in his chest had shifted. The specific relief of a man who has been in company all evening and finally met someone worth talking to. That had been 2 years ago. In 2 years they had arrived at a Tuesday. Every other Tuesday, when her schedule permitted, and his allowed it, they had coffee at a small place on West 42nd Street that was quiet enough to talk and unpretentious enough that neither of them had to perform. She argued with him when she disagreed, which was often, and she was right with a frequency he found both irritating and more valuable than he had words for. He had not told her what the Tuesdays meant to him. He was aware this was cowardice of a specific kind. He was also aware that she was a widow of 5 years who had built something careful and self-sufficient out of loss, and that walking into that carefully built life and announcing intentions required more than wanting to. It required being sure he could offer something worth the disruption. He was working on being sure. In the meantime, the Duke of Ashmere had decided to make it urgent. The Duke's name was Charles Everley. He had inherited the title, Baron Ashmere, elevated to Duke by letters patent in 1861 in recognition of his father's considerable wartime service to the Crown, and the family's textile fortune from a grandfather who had spent 40 years converting industrial money into the kind of respectability that money alone couldn't purchase, The elevation was legitimate. The pretension that accompanied it was not. Charles had grown up with a title and substantial wealth, and the particular worldview of a man who had been given enough to believe he deserved more. He had come to New York in 1879. He had not gone directly for the heiresses. That was too visible, too easily categorized. He had spent a year cultivating connections, donating to the right causes, appearing at the right events, making himself indispensable to the kind of people who controlled access to the people he actually wanted. By the fall of 1880, he was a fixture. Mrs. Vandermir invited him to galas. Senator Aldrich consulted him on matters of Anglo-American trade. He was considered charming, cultured, and eligible, and if certain people found something slightly too calculated about his charm, they kept the observation to themselves, because a duke's goodwill, however manufactured, was worth more than the satisfaction of saying so. Margaret had met him in January of 1880 at a dinner hosted by one of her patients, Mrs. Harlow. She had been there in her professional capacity, monitoring Mrs. Harlow's heart condition through what promised to be a stressful social evening. Charles Everly had been seated next to her and spent the meal being charming in the manner of a man who assumed the charm was welcome. She had been polite. She had not been interested. When he called on her 3 days later at her lodgings on West 23rd Street, she had received him in the front parlor, heard his intentions stated with the confidence of a man who expected a particular answer, and declined him with the direct clarity that was her natural idiom. He had smiled. He had said he was sure she would reconsider. He had left. She had not reconsidered. The second approach came in March, a letter several pages outlining the advantages of the connection. She had written back in 2 sentences. In April, he had appeared at a social event where she was working. She had moved to the other side of the room. He had followed. She had looked at him with the expression she used on difficult patients and said quietly, "Your Grace, I have given you my answer twice. I won't be changing it." He had looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had rearranged itself. He smiled. "We'll see," he said, and walked away. She had told Edmund about it on their next Tuesday. Edmund had listened without speaking, had asked 2 questions, had been very still in the way he was still when he was deciding something. "He's not going to stop," he said. "I know. Has he done anything actionable?" "Not yet." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not frightened of him. I want to be clear about that." "I know you're not frightened." He looked at her. "That's what concerns me. Men like him don't respond to fearlessness as a boundary. They respond to it as a problem to be solved. You think he'll escalate? I think he's accustomed to getting what he wants through attrition. When the direct approach fails, he finds leverage." She was quiet. "What leverage does he have?" Edmund had not answered immediately. He had thought about the kinds of leverage men like Charles Everly found: social pressure, rumor, legal threat, the specific machinery available to people with titles and solicitors, and the patience to deploy both. "I don't know yet," he had said, "but keep your records." She had looked at him with the slight expression he had learned to read as amused. "I always keep my records." "I know." The corner of his mouth had moved. "I'm reminding myself, not you." That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, the solicitor's letter, the fabricated debt, the medal. Edmund had spent those 3 weeks doing what he did with every problem that required resolution. Not reacting, but preparing. He had pulled the original commendation documents from his own records. He had written to Dr. Emmett. He had contacted the Army Records Office in Washington. He had also sent a quiet inquiry through a contact at a private bank about the Duke's actual financial standing in New York. The answer had been instructive. Charles Everly was not destitute. The textile inheritance remained substantial, but he was spending at a rate that outpaced his income, and the American heiresses he had initially targeted had proven less accessible than anticipated. A wealthy widow with property was at this stage of his New York tenure no longer a preference. She was a practical solution. Edmund had filed this alongside the rest and said nothing to Margaret, because he didn't tell her things until he had something worth telling. What he had not yet done was speak to Charles Everly directly. He was going to do that tonight. The Duke found Margaret first. Edmund was speaking with Colonel Reeves near the north end of the ballroom when he saw it. Charles Everly crossing the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had planned his route. Margaret was standing near the window, alone for the first time all evening, and she saw him coming and stood very still, not with fear, with the particular stillness of a woman deciding exactly how she was going to handle what was coming. Edmund excused himself from Reeves and moved through the room. Not quickly. He reached the window in time to hear Everly say, in that polished, carrying voice, "Mrs. Hale, you're looking particularly well this evening." "So, Your Grace," her voice was even, "I wasn't aware you'd be attending." "Mrs. Vandermir is most hospitable," he smiled. "I imagine you heard from my solicitor." "I did. And?" "And I'll be responding through my own solicitor." She held his gaze, as is appropriate. Everly's smile didn't waver. "I wonder if all that formality is necessary. Your husband contracted a debt. The medal was offered as security. I'm simply recovering what was pledged." "The medal was awarded by General Calloway in 1864 for valor at Cold Ridge," she said. "It was never pledged as security for anything. The documentation suggests otherwise." "Then the documentation is wrong, a beat, or fabricated." Something moved through Everly's expression. Not quite anger, the shadow of it. "That's a significant accusation, Mrs. Hale." "It's an accurate one." Edmund arrived adjacent to the conversation, not between them, beside her, which meant something different. "Everly." The Duke turned, something recalculated in his face. "General Calloway, I didn't see you there." "No." Edmund looked at him with the level attention he gave to dispatches from unreliable sources. "I believe I heard my name." "We were discussing the Commendation Medal," Everly said, recovering smoothly. "The one awarded to Lieutenant Hale at Cold Ridge. I was explaining to Mrs. Hale that my family has a prior financial claim." "Interesting," Edmund said, "since I awarded it." "The award itself is not in dispute. The subsequent financial arrangement—" "The note your solicitor provided," Edmund said, "claims the debt and the pledge were recorded in a signed letter dated October 1872. He kept his voice below the surrounding conversation. "Lieutenant Hale's service record shows he was on duty in Virginia through November of that year. Your solicitor's letter was reportedly signed in Baltimore." He held Everly's gaze. "That's a discrepancy." Everly's jaw tightened fractionally. "Men conduct private correspondence while on active duty, General." "They do." Edmund tilted his head slightly. "Which is why the handwriting matters. I've spent 30 years reading documents under pressure. When I see a signature with an ink composition inconsistent with the period of the letter, aniline dye on a document that should have been written with iron gall, I notice." He paused. "My solicitor has already written to a specialist." The Polish thinned. For just a moment, behind the charm and the manufactured ease, something harder and less certain looked out of Charles Everly's face. "You're very confident," he said. "I'm accurate," Edmund said. "Good evening, Your Grace." He did not look at Everly again. He turned to Margaret, who was watching him with those dark, direct eyes, and offered his arm. She took it, and they walked away from the window together, and Edmund felt the Duke's gaze on his back the entire length of the room. "Ink composition," Margaret said quietly when they were far enough away. "Aniline dye became commercially available in 1863, but wasn't common in American correspondence until the mid-1870s. If Thomas wrote that letter in 1872, it would be on iron gall. The solicitor's document is not." He paused. "I had it examined by a chemist last week." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been building this for weeks." "Since you told me about the letter." She looked at him sideways, the way she looked at him when she was deciding whether to say something. "You might have mentioned that. I didn't want to tell you I was looking until I had something worth telling." "That's very like you." "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation." The edge of her mouth moved. "A fond one." Edmund said nothing. Something in his chest shifted, the same small significant shift he had first felt 16 years ago in a field hospital at Brannock Creek, when a woman with ink on her hand had told him he would manage and been right. They stood together near the east column, and the gala moved around them, and the Duke of Ashmere watched from across the room with the expression of a man revising his strategy. The letter arrived 4 days after the gala. Not to Margaret, to Edmund. It was written on the Duke's personal stationery, in formal language designed to sound reasonable, while saying something unreasonable. 4 careful paragraphs expressing concern that General Calloway's personal interest in Mrs. Hale might be affecting his judgment. It noted with deliberate delicacy that Mrs. Hale's presence in certain military and social circles was a matter of some discussion. It suggested that perhaps the General's reputation would be better served by a more measured distance from a woman of uncertain standing. It concluded by observing that the upcoming January Review Board, at which Edmund was expected to present the Army's strategic recommendations for the coming year, would benefit from a general who was seen to be above reproach in all personal matters. Edmund read it twice, set it on his desk, poured 2 fingers of bourbon and did not drink them. Then he read it a 3rd time, marking every implication with the methodical attention he brought to enemy dispatches. The shape was clear. This was not a threat made in anger. This was a constructed document written with the help of someone who understood institutions and their vulnerabilities. The January Review Board was the specific pressure point. Edmund's recommendations carried significant weight with the Army's Appropriations Committee, and there were always people, who would prefer those recommendations made by a general whose personal life offered no complications. Not because they cared about his personal life, because a compromised general was a general whose authority could be questioned, whose influence could be redirected. Everly had found the lever. Edmund thought about Margaret, who was on West 23rd Street right now, reading patient notes or arguing with a medical textbook, entirely unaware she had become a tactical asset in someone else's game. He thought about the single non-negotiable fact of his relationship with Margaret Hale, that he told her the truth. That had been true from the first Tuesday. It would remain true now. He picked up his pen, wrote, "Tuesday, same time, it's important." Sent it. She was already there when he arrived. She was at their usual table, 2 cups already poured, and she looked at his face when he came through the door and said, "He wrote to you." "Yes, Edmund, sir. How did you know?" "Because the next logical move was to threaten what you value." She watched him. What did he threaten? "The January Review Board. My credibility with the Appropriations Committee." He looked at her. "He's suggesting my association with a woman of uncertain standing impairs my professional authority." She absorbed this without visible reaction. "He's suggesting your judgment is compromised." "Yes." She was quiet, drank her coffee. Outside the window, the November city moved past. Pedestrians, horse cars, a newsboy shouting headlines about something congressional. The ordinary machinery of a world that didn't know it was being used. "I'm going to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "If I were simply a former patient, someone you respected professionally, nothing more." She met his eyes. "Would you still be fighting this?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because what he's doing is wrong. He said it the way he said things that didn't require elaboration. He's fabricating documents to take a medal from a widow. He's using social pressure to force a woman into a marriage she's refused twice. He's threatening careers to remove obstacles." A pause. "That's wrong regardless of who the woman is." She held his gaze. "That's not the only reason." "No." The words sat between them. She did not look away. "Edmund." She said his name with the quiet precision she always did. "What are we doing?" He was quiet for a moment. The coffee was very good. He noted this the way he noted everything about Tuesdays. "I have spent 2 years being careful," he said, "because you had lost something and were building something, and I didn't want to walk into that and make it about me." He set down his cup. "But Everly has made it about me, regardless. And now that it is..." He paused, choosing with the care he brought to everything important. "I find I'm less interested in being careful than in being clear." She waited. "I have been in 22 rooms this year," he said. "Ballrooms and drawing rooms and military briefings and Senate chambers. Every one of them is emptier when you're not in it." He held her gaze. "That is what we're doing, Margaret. I should have said it 6 months ago." She looked at him for a long time. Her face did the thing where she was deciding how much to show, and then the other thing, the rarer thing, where she decided to show it anyway. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a while." "And?" "And I've been waiting for you to say it." The small, warm smile appeared. "You're very good at strategy, Edmund. You're occasionally slow at the obvious." He felt the thing in his chest again, the shift, and this time he didn't file it away. "Noted," he said. She looked at him and the smile stayed. "So, what do we do about the Duke?" He wrapped his hands around his cup. "We document everything. We build the case. We wait for him to make the mistake that exposes him completely. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," he said, "we stop pretending there's nothing to protect." The Duke moved faster than Edmund had expected. By the second week of November, The whispers had organized. He heard them first from Reeves, who reported them with the uncomfortable expression of a man delivering news he wished he could reframe. Then from Senator Aldrich, who raised the subject over cigars at the Union Club with the careful detachment of someone wanting to appear neutral. Then from 3 separate social invitations that arrived within 48 hours, all phrased in language that was warm but slightly too deliberate, people making a public record of continued goodwill. The whispers were specific. That was what told him the source. Vague rumors mutated as they traveled. These were too consistent, the same shape in every version, the same careful, almost accusation. She had sought him out. She had used her access to his regiment to establish a connection that was not professional. Her presence in New York was not coincidental. The widowhood was convenient. It was, Edmund thought, technically efficient. Everly had said nothing actionable. He had said things adjacent to actionable, to people who would repeat them, and let the social machinery do the rest. He had chosen his audience carefully, not gossips, but the deliberate kind of person whose withdrawn patronage would be noticed without any public scene. No drawing-room confrontations, no visible scandal. Just a quiet, coordinated withdrawal of access, administered through the particular politeness of the Gilded Age, which had perfected the art of destruction by omission. The effect on Margaret was immediate and practical. 2 clients sent polite notes citing changed circumstances. A third, Mrs. Harlow, whose heart condition Margaret had been managing for 8 months, did not send a note. She simply stopped answering messages. Margaret told him on their Tuesday, with the contained composure she brought to everything difficult. She listed the losses the way she would list a patient's symptoms, clearly, without inflation, without allowing the facts to be softened by the way they felt. 3 clients, she said, approximately a third of my income. Mrs. Harlow is the most significant. She's been my most consistent reference for the past year. A pause. If she withdraws quietly, others will follow. There won't be a scene. There doesn't need to be. No. Edmund looked at her. That's the design. No scene, no accusation anyone can directly refute, just closed doors. He understands how this city actually works. She said it without admiration, but precisely. It's not the Duke making noise. It's 20 people saying nothing. He's had help. Edmund had been thinking about this since Reeves first reported it. Someone in his circle understands the specific mechanics of professional reputation in New York. This isn't a man acting on wounded pride. His solicitor? Possibly someone further back. He turned his cup in his hands. It doesn't matter who designed it. What matters is that it's working and we need to change the mechanism. The mechanism is social pressure applied quietly enough that no one can be held accountable. She looked at him. The only counter is making something public that he can't control. Yes. She was quiet. What are you building? He reached into his coat and set 3 documents on the table between them. She looked at them. What are these? The original commendation records for Cold Ridge. Thomas's full service file, including his deployment record for 1872. He pointed to each. And a deposition from Dr. Emmett, confirming that Thomas's financial affairs were entirely settled at the time of his death, with no outstanding debts to any foreign party. She looked at the documents, then at him. How long have you had these? The commendation record since September, the service file since October. The Emmett deposition arrived last week. You've been building this since September. Since you mentioned Everly the first time. She looked at the papers for a long moment. Her hand moved to her left pocket, the small unconscious gesture she made when she was thinking about the medal, which she carried always. He had noticed the gesture months ago and not mentioned it. The ink analysis, she said. The aniline dye. I have the chemist's written assessment. Aniline dye on a document that, if genuine, would have been written in 1872. Iron gall was standard in American correspondence until the mid-1870s. The inconsistency is documented and attestable. He paused. It's not proof of forgery on its own. But combined with the deployment record, Thomas being in Virginia when the Baltimore letter was supposedly signed, and the Emmett deposition, it builds a case that no honest solicitor wants to stand behind. She absorbed this. Everly's solicitor will withdraw. When he sees the full documentation, yes, he was retained on the basis of a signed note. When he understands the note is fabricated and that fabrication can be demonstrated in a legal proceeding, continuing to represent the claim becomes a liability. And if Everly finds another solicitor? Then we go to the formal hearing and present everything in front of a judge. Edmund looked at her steadily. He doesn't want that. A hearing means discovery. Discovery means the forged document gets examined by people appointed by the court rather than people appointed by him. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November city moved past, indifferent and busy. "He's been counting on me not having the resources to contest this formally," she said. "Or the support." His voice remained level. "He was wrong on both." She looked at him, and in her face was the expression he had come to value above most things, the one where she had assessed something and found it sound and was deciding whether to say so directly. "All right," she said. "What do we do first?" "How you write to your solicitor today. Contest the claim formally, put it on record." He picked up the Emmett deposition. "Second, you give him this. Emmett is willing to testify if it comes to a hearing." "And third?" "Third," he paused, "the medal." She reached into her pocket and set it on the table between them. It was a small thing, a bronze disc on a faded ribbon. The engraving on the face read Coldridge, September 1864, for valor. On the reverse, in small, neat letters, Letter T. Hale, 9th Infantry. Edmund looked at it. He had held it once before, briefly, when he presented it, had pressed it into Thomas Hale's hand in the field, with the weight of a gesture that stood in for everything he couldn't say about what the man had done that day. "I awarded this," he said. "I know. I awarded it to Thomas personally. I can testify to the date, the conditions, the witnesses." He looked up at her. "And I can testify that at no point during Thomas Hale's service was there any financial arrangement between him and any European party. I have 30 years of credibility with the army and the courts, and I am prepared to put every inch of it on this table." She was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "You remember every detail." "I remember everything I've decided to remember." He held her gaze. "I decided to remember Thomas Hale." She was quiet. Her fingers were near the medal but not touching it, hovering. "He would have found all of this ridiculous," she said. "Thomas, he had no patience for politics. He always said the army's bureaucracy was more dangerous than the Confederates because at least the Confederates were honest about wanting to kill you." Edmund felt the corner of his mouth move. "He said that to me once, almost exactly." She looked at him. The expression shifted. Something warmer. Something that was about Thomas and also about Edmund, and about the way the dead remained present in the lives of people who had loved them honestly. "He liked you," she said. "He didn't say it often. He wasn't someone who said things often, but he mentioned you in his letters, said you were the only general he'd served under, who read the terrain before he read the reports." Edmund said nothing, but something in him was very still. "He would have been glad," Margaret said quietly, "that it's you." She picked up the medal, held it for a moment, then placed it back in her pocket with the careful precision of someone returning something irreplaceable to its proper location. "File the challenge," Edmund said. His voice was even. "Today," she agreed. She gathered the documents he had placed on the table, handling them with the efficient care she brought to everything important. "Edmund," she looked up. "Yes." "When this is over," she held his gaze, "when the Duke is handled and the documentation is filed and the case is closed." A pause. "We're going to have a different conversation." He looked at her, at the dark, steady eyes and the contained composure, and the hand resting near her pocket where the medal was. "Yes," he said, "we are." She nodded once, rose, put on her coat. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday." She walked out into the November street, and Edmund Calloway sat with his coffee. Very good, always very good, because he had been ensuring it since the second Tuesday, and looked at the space across the table where she had been. Not empty. It had not felt empty since she started occupying it. Outside, Charles Everleigh's machinery continued turning. The whispers made their rounds. 3 clients had gone, and more might follow, and the Duke was planning his next move with the patience of a man who believed he had time on his side. He did not know about the Emmett deposition. He did not know about the chemist's analysis of the ink. He did not know that for every week he had spent building pressure through omission and implication, a general who had spent 30 years reading terrain before reading reports had been quietly assembling something that didn't need to be loud to be devastating. He had one move left. Edmund knew it. The Vandermir Winter Gala in December, the largest social event of the season, the room where an engagement announcement would land with maximum visibility before anyone could organize a response. Everleigh would make his move there publicly. counting on the momentum of the moment to do what private persuasion had failed to do. He would make his announcement. And General Edmund Calloway, who had never lost an engagement he had properly prepared for, would be ready. New York City, December 1880. The Vandermir Winter Gala was the social event of the season, which meant it was the kind of room where reputations were made and destroyed with equal efficiency, and everyone present understood both possibilities and came anyway. Edmund arrived at 8 o'clock with the documents in his interior coat pocket and Lieutenant Graves at his left shoulder. Graves was 26, quiet, and had the quality Edmund valued most in the men he kept close. He did exactly what he was told, no more and no less, and he did not ask questions until the asking was appropriate. "The solicitor is confirmed," Edmund said as they handed their coats to the attendant. "Arrived 10 minutes ago, sir. East anteroom with the full documentation." Graves kept his voice below the ambient noise of the ballroom. "Judge Harrington's clerk is also present as requested." "And Morrison?" "In position near the service corridor." Edmund nodded, stepped into the ballroom. The same room as October, 12 chandeliers, 300 guests imported marble, but carrying the additional weight of a December occasion, garlands and candlelight, and the heightened energy of people who had been building toward this evening for weeks. The orchestra played something Viennese. Champagne moved through the crowd on silver trays. Edmund scanned the room in the first 30 seconds and found what he was looking for. Margaret was near the north window in dark green silk, speaking with Mrs. Emmett, the doctor's wife who had come down from Boston specifically for this evening, which had been arranged and was not coincidental. Margaret looked composed. She had known since Thursday exactly what tonight was going to be. She had listened to the plan with her hands around her coffee cup, asked 4 precise questions and said, "All right," in the tone she used when she had assessed something and found it sound. He did not go to her immediately. He moved through the room, speaking to the people he needed to speak to, placing himself in the sight lines he needed to occupy, establishing position, confirming resources, accounting for variables. Charles Everly was in the center of the room. As expected, he was in excellent form, animated, smiling, working the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had decided this was his night. He had dressed for an occasion. Edmund noted this. Men dressed with that particular deliberate care when they intended to be remembered. Everly's eyes found Edmund's across the room. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, recalibration. He had planned for Edmund here. He smiled with his teeth and inclined his head, and Edmund returned the acknowledgement with the minimal precision of a man whose absence of reaction was itself a message. He moved to the edge of the room and waited. At 9:15, Charles Everly called for quiet. He did it well, a gesture to the orchestra which faded mid-phrase, a raised glass, the confident posture of a man who had rehearsed this. The room stilled with the interested attention of people who recognized a planned moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried beautifully, "I hope you'll forgive me for interrupting the evening with a personal matter. I have news I find I cannot wait to share." Edmund was watching Margaret. She was very still, her hand resting near her left pocket. "Many of you know Mrs. Margaret Hale." The room shifted, attention moving toward her. A remarkable woman, admirable, accomplished, and I'm pleased to say, soon to be the Duchess of Ashmere. The room produced the sound that rooms produced at unexpected announcements, a collective intake, whispers, the rustle of attention reorganizing itself. Several people looked at Margaret. Several looked at Edmund. A few looked between the two with the sharp interest of people who sensed something underneath this moment they hadn't been given access to yet. Margaret did not look at the room. She looked at Everly with the calm attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this and said nothing. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Into it, Mrs. Emmett, positioned at Margaret's side precisely for this purpose, a woman of 60 with the social authority of 2 decades of Boston medical philanthropy, said with perfect conversational ease and just enough carrying power, "How extraordinary. Mrs. Hale said nothing of this to me. We were speaking not 5 minutes ago." It was not a confrontation. It was the Gilded Age equivalent of one. A planted doubt, delivered by an unimpeachable source in a tone of mild social bewilderment. Several heads turned. Several expressions shifted from congratulatory to uncertain. Everly's smile held, but the timing was off now. He looked at Margaret. "My dear." "Your Grace." Margaret's voice was quiet, addressed to him alone, heard by the 8 people nearest her and no one else, perfectly calibrated. "I think we should speak privately." It was the correct move for the room. No scene, no raised voices, nothing a society page could describe as unseemly. Just a widow, composed and unreadable, requesting a private word. Every woman in earshot registered it. Every woman in earshot understood it was not agreement. Everly had no graceful refusal. He offered his arm. She did not take it. She simply walked toward the east anteroom, and he followed, because the alternative was to stand in the center of a ballroom that was watching him with the polite, attentive expression of 300 people deciding what they thought. Edmund was already moving. The east anteroom was a small room, brocade wallpaper, 2 settees, the kind of space designed for the delicate conversations that ballrooms couldn't contain. Edmund's solicitor, Mr. Crane, was there when they entered, standing near the writing table with his case open. Judge Harrington's clerk sat in the corner with a leather portfolio. Morrison stood by the door. Everly walked in and stopped. He looked at the room, at Crane, at the clerk, at the documents already laid on the writing table, and his expression did the thing Edmund had been waiting for it to do. Not collapse. Revision. The rapid internal recalculation of a tactician who had just walked into a prepared position. He was good. Edmund gave him that. His face recovered in under 2 seconds. "General Calloway," he said, with something approximating amusement, "this is rather theatrical." "This is rather efficient," Edmund said. "Sit down, Your Grace." Everly looked at Margaret. She had taken a position near the writing table, her hands at her sides, her face entirely composed. She did not look like a woman who had just been publicly claimed without her consent. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for this room for 6 weeks. Everly sat. Edmund remained standing. "3 weeks ago, your solicitor submitted a claim against Mrs. Hale's property, specifically her late husband's military commendation medal, on the basis of a debt contracted in Baltimore in 1872 and secured by a signed letter." He picked up the first document from the table. "This is a copy of that letter which your solicitor provided." Everly said nothing. "This, the second document, is Lieutenant Thomas Hale's service record, including his deployment log for the fall of 1872. He was on active duty in Virginia from September through November of that year. The letter from your solicitor is dated October 14, 1872, and is signed in Baltimore." Edmund set both documents side by side on the table, facing Everly. Lieutenant Hale was not in Baltimore in October of 1872. He could not have signed this letter. A beat of silence. "Men arrange correspondence through intermediaries," Everly said. His voice was level. "A proxy signature is not uncommon." "A proxy signature," Edmund said, "would be noted as such in the document. This letter is presented as Thomas Hale's direct signature." He picked up the third document, the chemist's assessment, 2 pages, dense with technical notation. "I retained a document examiner. The ink used in the signature on your solicitor's letter is an aniline-based dye. Aniline dye was not in common commercial use in American correspondence until 1875 at the earliest. Iron gall ink was standard prior to that date." He set the assessment on the table. "Lieutenant Hale died in 1875. The letter is dated 1872. The ink is inconsistent with both the date and the period." Everly looked at the documents. Something was happening in his face, very controlled, very careful, but happening. "Furthermore," Edmund continued, "I have a deposition from Dr. Harlan Emmett of Boston, who attended Lieutenant Hale in Baltimore in 1874 and reviewed his financial affairs at that time. There is no record of any debt to any European party. Thomas Hale's estate was settled in 1875 with no outstanding foreign obligations." He placed the Emmett deposition on the table. "Your solicitor was given a forged document. He may not have known it was forged. That is a question for him to answer." Edmund looked at Everly directly. "You, however, provided it to him." The room was very quiet. Margaret stood with her hands at her sides and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The documents said it. The chemist said it. Dr. Emmett said it. Every piece of paper on that table said it in the language that this city, in this decade, in this room, actually understood. Not the language of public scenes or raised voices, but the language of documentation, attestation, and professional credibility stacked in a pile that no amount of charm could dismantle. Everly looked at the table, then at Edmund, then for the first time at Mr. Crane. "I would recommend," Crane said with the measured calm of a man who had been practicing law in New York for 30 years, "that your solicitor withdraw the claim, today, before this reaches a formal hearing, at which point the document examiner's findings become a matter of public record." Everly was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the carrying polish of the ballroom. "And if I instruct him to proceed?" "Then we proceed," Edmund said. "A formal hearing, full discovery. The forged letter examined by a court-appointed expert. Your financial records in New York subpoenaed, which I believe would be instructive given the timeline of your interest in Mrs. Hale's circumstances." He paused. "And Judge Harrington's clerk, who is sitting in this room right now, will have documented this entire conversation." Everly looked at the clerk. The clerk looked back with the expression of a man who was doing his job and would continue doing it regardless of preference. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Then Everly stood, straightened his coat with the automatic precision of a man reaching for composure through gesture. He looked at Margaret, and in his face was something she had not seen there before, not anger, not calculation, but the specific expression of a man who had been completely and efficiently outmaneuvered, and knew it. "You planned this in detail," he said. "Yes," Edmund said. "Since when?" "September." Something moved through Everly's expression. For just a moment, behind the manufactured ease and the title and the 3 years of careful social construction, she saw the simpler thing underneath. A man who had wanted something, reached for it the only way he knew how, and found the reach had been anticipated at every point. He looked at Margaret one last time, not with malice, with something that was almost in its stripped-down form, closer to recognition. She met his gaze and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the room hadn't already said better. Everly walked to the door. Morrison stepped aside. He left without looking back, and his footsteps faded into the ballroom noise, and the door clicked shut behind him. The room breathed. Margaret looked at the documents still spread on the writing table, the service record, the chemist's assessment, the Emmett deposition, the copy of the forged letter, and then looked at Edmund. "His solicitor will withdraw by morning," Crane said from the corner. "The moment I send him the examiner's report, he'll have no choice." "Yes," Edmund said. He was still looking at Margaret. She reached into her left pocket, took out the medal, held it in her palm for a moment, the bronze disc on its faded ribbon, Cold Ridge, September 1864, for valor, and then closed her fingers around it. "Now," she said quietly, "it's done." Edmund looked at her closed hand and felt something unlock in his chest, something he had been holding in careful reserve for 16 years, through a war and a hospital and a decade of distance and 2 years of Tuesdays, and he understood with the clarity he usually reserved for terrain assessments that he was entirely done being careful. "Yes," he said, "it is." He offered his arm. She took it. They walked back into the ballroom together, and if the room noticed they had been gone, it had the good manners of the Gilded Age and said nothing about it directly. Mrs. Emmett caught Margaret's eye across the room, and the slight lift of Margaret's chin told her everything she needed to know. "Mrs." Vandermir, who had positioned herself near the east anteroom entrance, and was not a woman who missed things, simply smiled and returned to her guests. Charles Everly collected his coat from the attendant at 11 minutes past 9 and left the Vandermir Winter Gala without speaking to anyone of consequence. His solicitor withdrew from the case before breakfast. The room recovered the way rooms recovered, gradually with noise, the social machinery restarting itself after the interruption of an announcement that had landed awkwardly and then quietly disappeared. People moved, regrouped, began processing what they had witnessed and deciding what it meant. Most of them, Edmund noted, had witnessed very little. A duke had made an announcement. Mrs. Emmett had expressed mild surprise. The duke had left early. These were the visible facts, and they were enough. What happened in the east anteroom would remain there. That was the point. Margaret stood near the north window for a few minutes, while the room gave her the berth it extended to people who had just been through something. Mrs. Emmett appeared at her side. Then Mrs. Vandermir, who touched her hand. Then 2 other women whose withdrawal of social goodwill over the past month had been quiet and deliberate, and whose reappearance now was equally quiet and equally deliberate. The Gilded Age worked in both directions. Edmund had counted on that. When the cluster around her thinned, he crossed the room. She turned before he reached her, as she often did. "Mrs. Emmett sends her regards," she said. She says Dr. Emmett's deposition was the most useful thing he's done in a year, and she'll be telling him so. It was well written. He was precise about the dates. I told him to be. She looked at him. You didn't tell me you'd asked him. I asked him in September. You hadn't met me for coffee yet that week. You were planning in September. Preparing, there's a difference. He held her gaze. Preparing is what you do before you know which plan you'll need. She looked at him with the expression she used when he said things she found both accurate and slightly impossible. How many plans did you have? 4. Of course. The edge of her mouth moved. What were the other 3? One involved the January Review Board and was considerably less elegant. One required Judge Harrington himself rather than his clerk and would have taken 3 months. One, he paused, involved your public testimony, which I didn't want to use because it would have required you to speak about Thomas in a formal setting. You were protecting me from that. I was giving you the option of not doing it. He looked at her steadily. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Around them the gala continued. Restored, unremarkable, 300 people conducting the ordinary business of a December evening. He won't try again. No. The withdrawal of the solicitor makes the forgery effectively a matter of record between the parties, even without a formal proceeding. He knows it can be produced if he moves against you again. Edmund paused. He'll leave New York within the year. His financial situation makes another season here unlikely regardless. She absorbed this. You looked into his finances. In October. It clarified his motivation. He held her gaze. He needed a solution. You were convenient, and then you were resistant, and then you were the thing he'd decided to have regardless. Because men like that don't distinguish between wanting something and being owed it. She looked at him for a long moment. And you do? I do what? Distinguish between wanting something and being owed it. He was still. Yes. I know, her voice was soft. I've known for a while. Outside the window, December New York moved through its cold dark. Gas lamps, carriages, the city's indifferent machinery, proceeding without awareness of the small room and the ante-room, and the documents, and the thing that had just been settled. She was looking at the street, and he was looking at her. And the thing that had been between them for 2 years, carefully maintained, carefully unnamed, had shifted its shape in the east anteroom the moment she closed her hand around the medal, and said, now it's done. And both of them knew it. Margaret, he said. She turned. I would like to leave. She looked at him, not surprised. The small warm smile appeared, the one he had been cataloguing for 2 years, that he valued more than anything in this city. So would I. He found Graves, said 3 words and collected their coats. She took his arm at the entrance and they walked out of the Vandermir ballroom together, past the attendants and the cold that met them at the door like a physical fact. The carriage was waiting. He had stopped leaving things to chance where she was concerned approximately 2 years ago. She got in. He followed. The door closed and the carriage began to move, and December New York passed outside the windows, lit at intervals by gas lamps. They sat in silence for a moment. 22 rooms, he said. She looked at him. This year, 22 rooms that felt empty because you weren't in them. He held her gaze. And then tonight, the anteroom. You standing at that table with the documents I'd built for 6 weeks, and the medal in your hand, and your face completely composed. He paused. That room was not empty. It was not. She was quiet for a moment. 23, she said. I'm sorry? Tonight makes 23. The smile was still there, small and certain. You forgot to count the one you were standing in when you finally stopped being careful. He looked at her. He felt the corner of his mouth move, not the fractional concession she had described once to Mrs. Emmett, but the full thing, real and unhurried, and she saw it, and her smile deepened in response. I have been in love with you, he said, since a Tuesday in October of 1878, when you told me my assessment of the Sternberg report was technically correct and humanly bankrupt, and then explained why, and were right. He paused. I didn't have the word for it immediately. I worked backward from the evidence. She laughed, warm and unguarded, the laugh he had been cataloguing for 2 years. You fell in love with me because I criticized your analysis. I fell in love with you because you were right, and you said so without softening it. He held her gaze. I've been surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear for 30 years. You have never once done that. I'm not going to start. I know. His hand found hers on the seat between them, and her fingers closed around his without hesitation. That's the point. She looked at him, at the controlled face and the careful eyes and the man underneath the general, real and specific, and worth every carefully folded day of the waiting. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "Stop being careful." He looked at her for one moment. Then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not a careful one. It was the kiss of a man who had been precise about everything for 30 years and had decided finally to stop being precise about this, warm and certain, and carrying the full weight of 2 years of Tuesdays and 23 empty rooms and every moment he had filed away for later. She kissed him back with equal certainty, her free hand coming up to his jaw, and the carriage moved through the December streets and neither of them noticed. When they separated, they were both very still. "There," he said quietly. "There," she agreed. She was still holding his hand. He was not inclined to change this. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "I know what you're going to ask. You always know. You're very legible to me, Edmund. You always have been." The smile again. "Ask anyway." He held her gaze. "Marry me. Not because of Everly, not because of the scandal, not because it resolves any practical problem." His hand tightened around hers. "Because I have been in 23 empty rooms, and I don't want to be in empty rooms anymore. Because you are the only person who has ever told me the truth without flinching, and I intend to have that for the rest of my life." He paused. "Because I love you. And because I believe, based on the available evidence, that you love me." "The available evidence," she said. "You're holding my hand in a carriage at 9:30 on a December evening. I documented it." She laughed again. He felt it like warmth. "Yes," she said. "Edmund Calloway, yes." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, not the formal gesture it would have been 6 weeks ago, but something that meant what it meant. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the carriage rolled through December New York, and outside the city continued its indifferent business. And between them, there was nothing but the specific peace of two people who had stopped being careful at exactly the right moment. New York City, March 1881. The wedding took place on a Saturday morning, in the 3rd week of March, in the small chapel on West 21st Street that Margaret had attended since moving to New York. Edmund had suggested the Union Club. She had looked at him with the expression she reserved for suggestions that were technically reasonable and completely wrong, and he had deferred without argument, which she told Mrs. Emmett afterward was the moment she knew with absolute certainty she was making the correct decision. 60 people, Margaret's list precisely observed. Nothing on it that wasn't meant to be there, nothing absent that should have been present. Edmund had reviewed it once, suggested 2 additions from his military circle, and accepted her revisions to those suggestions without comment, which she also filed under evidence. Dr. Emmett came down from Boston with his wife. Colonel Reeves attended with an expression of such genuine relief that Edmund asked him about it afterward, and Reeves said, "Sir, we have all been waiting for this for 2 years," which Edmund absorbed without comment and filed under things he probably should have moved faster on. Senator Aldrich came, Judge Harrington came, Mrs. Vandermir came and wept productively, and said afterward it was the most satisfying social event she had attended in a decade, which Margaret found more meaningful than most compliments because it was specific. Margaret wore ivory silk and her mother's earrings, and the medal pinned inside her left lapel, where no one could see it but her. She had shown Edmund that morning, opening her lapel briefly in the foyer of the chapel, and he had looked at it. Cold Ridge, September 1864, for valor. And then looked at her and said nothing, which was how he said the things that mattered most. She carried white flowers and walked without ceremony down the aisle of the small chapel, and found Edmund at the end of it. He was in his dress uniform because she had asked him to wear it, and he had agreed without question. He watched her the entire length of the aisle with the focused attention that was his natural register, and when she reached him she said quietly, "You're staring." "Yes," he said. He did not stop. The ceremony was brief and exact, which suited them both. They said the words that needed to be said with the directness that was their natural idiom. No performance, no elaboration, just the clear statement of what they intended. When the minister reached the end of it, Edmund kissed her with the same warmth and certainty as the first time in the carriage, and Colonel Reeves started something that may technically have been applause, which the minister appeared to find unprecedented. At the reception, held at Vandermir House at Mrs. Vandermeer's insistence and Margaret's eventual agreement, Edmund stood near the east column, the same column he had stood near in October, watching the room with the tactical attention that was his lifelong habit. The room was not empty. It had not been empty since the woman in dark green silk had stood near the north window, and the truth of that had not diminished. He could feel her location in the room the way he could feel weather changing, a constant, reliable awareness that was not dramatic but was entirely unlike anything else. She found him at the edge of the reception 40 minutes in, when the guests were dispersing into smaller conversations, and the formal part of the evening was giving way to the informal. She came to stand beside him the way she always did, directly, without announcement, as though it were the logical conclusion of wherever she had been. "Mrs. Emmett has opinions about the hospital program," she said. She always has opinions. "In this case, they're useful ones." She looked at him. "She knows 3 women in Boston who trained under Emmett and are looking for placement. If we're building the program properly, we'll need faculty before we need students." He turned to look at her. "You're already planning." "I've been planning since November." She met his gaze. "I told you I always keep my records. I've also been keeping notes." The corner of his mouth moved. "Show me." "Tomorrow. Over coffee." "Over very good coffee." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. His wife, which was still a fact he was processing with the slow thoroughness he brought to facts that mattered. And the small, warm smile appeared. "Edmund." "Yes." "Are you happy?" He considered the question with the same deliberate honesty he had been giving her for 2 years, because she asked real questions and deserved real answers, and because the non-negotiable fact of their relationship from its first Tuesday to this reception to every tomorrow they had arranged was the truth. "Yes," he said, "I am." She leaned briefly against his shoulder, a gesture that was entirely her, small and undemonstrative and meaning everything, and then straightened, because there were people to speak with, and a program to plan, and coffee to be had in the morning, and Margaret Hale Calloway was not a woman who allowed happiness to substitute for usefulness. She was, however, a woman who paused at the door of the East Room and turned back to look at him, one look direct and warm and carrying everything it needed to carry, before she walked through it. Edmund Calloway stood in the room with the 12 chandeliers, and the 60 guests and the warm noise of people who had come because they meant to, and he stood in it the way he had stood in every room this year. Not waiting, not scanning, not cataloguing empty space. He stood in it like a man who had found what he came for and intended to keep it, and turned and followed his wife through the door. Behind him the reception continued. The orchestra played. New York in March moved through the last of its winter cold, indifferent as always to the private revolutions of ordinary people choosing each other over easier things. Ahead of him through the door the sound of her voice arguing, he was almost certain, with Mrs. Emmett about curriculum structure, because she had opinions and she stated them, because she always had, and he had loved her for it since a Tuesday in October, and intended to love her for it until there were no more Tuesdays left. He walked through the door. The room behind him was empty. He didn't look back.